All right, I am here. Now, the question is, should I start with the patch notes or should I not? And I haven't gone through it all myself, reading it myself, but I'm very excited about the patch notes itself. And you can tell from my excitement, especially with my initial screen here showing something that I enjoyed playing during the time that it did happen for a previous game that was actually very cool, right? So maybe I'll leave it for a little later, but my excitement is just killing me now. So let's go ahead and work on that right now. So we have this PTR patch notes preview 2.7.6, and it is happening August 15 through 29. And so, what are they going to do for season 29? So they will have the solo self found, which is going to be helpful for, you know, those that actually want to play and enjoyed playing this throughout many seasons that have challenged themselves with the solo self found. So that is amazing for that category. And then we have Paragon ceilings, which will be interesting as well. And then we have the Visions of Amity, and that is the seasonal theme as far as the theme is concerned. And I am very excited because the theme reminds me of Guild Wars original. I mean, even the Paragon ceiling has a little bit towards Guild Wars original, by means of level cap and whatnot. Level cap, not so much gear cap because our gear, the stats change, right? But in Guild Wars original, we have the level cap that causes the gear cap. So it and the gear is like static. So it's basically on how you play the skill bar. But anyway, that is a very short snippet of Guild Wars original in terms of that. But my excitement goes with the Vision of Enmity. So now this is my initial take. So I'm just not very familiar with what these fissures are, right? Now, in terms of what I want to talk about and what I want to focus on are these new monster affixes, right? And before I even begin reading, before I even begin reading, um, I'm not talking about copyright issues or anything like that. None of that at all. Like this is bound to happen in each game in itself. But what I want to focus on is that over the years, especially when many players have begun talking about endless dungeons, right? And on that topic of endless dungeons, I have my own craving for zones that have these new monster affixes, but not as a monster affix, but as a zone affix or zone kind of um effect, right? And speaking of zone effects, um, in Guild Wars Original, with the expansions. Obviously, after expansions, where they've were in this case, it's factions expansion, right? And they even went further in factions where they released like two or three bigger dungeons, one of which is called Urga's Warren at the time. And if you already start reading through the content table of contents, right? I know it's kind of small on the screen. I can actually, you know, make it slightly. Yeah, let's go like that, right? And you can see it has energy degeneration, exhaustion, weakness, health degeneration. Okay, the table of contents already have a significant idea of what I'm about to talk about, right? But it's not just the fact of these effects, but what Urgos Warren was like. So, what was Urgos Warren like? Urgos Warren like were basically zones of the entire dungeon where each zone marked by the numbers here have those certain effects. And in relation to these new monster affixes, these zones were part of these affixes that we're talking about. So on the map, there's these icons, right? And these icons relate to the ones in the table here. So while in this area, foes suffer from -4 energy generation. So foes meaning us really, okay? Because the monsters are the ones, right? And we are the foes entering the zone. So when when there's energy drain, for example, while in the area, foes suffer from -4 energy degeneration. It means that the healers cannot enter this zone. They have to play from outside, like on the edge. So they have to play on the edges. So like they can't enter the door. If there's a door or like a gap between zone 1 and 2, they have to play at the nearest possible spot, right? To do group heals, for example. And so on and so on. So there's different effects, like while in the area, every spell cast causes exhaustion. While in this area, you deal 66% less damage with attacks, and your attributes are reduced by 1. So like, and then there are safe spots that you can stand in, right? So there are some spots that are like clearly safe before the next. So it really means that there's nothing in between that you have to deal with in case of any issues. Like there are certain spots that like you can take a break, right? But anyway, my concentration goes with this Urgos Warren effects to these. So what are the new monster affixes that are coming up for season 29? Innervating creates an area of effect around the monster that reduces the player's movement speed by 65% and cooldown reduction by 50% if the player is in the vicinity of the monster. So while there isn't any movement speed thing on the Guild Wars original Urgos Warren, over the years I've talked about Endless Dungeon that other people have mentioned before, where I thought of, well, what if floor one, right? What if floor one was like a movement speed debuff? So for the next floor, it would be another kind of debuff, like health degeneration, for example. So this enervating affix is really just that. But instead of being a zone wide issue, it is a monster affix, right? And then we have necrotic. The player's healing is reduced by 65%. Monsters have a damage over time effect that deals 180% of the player's max health over 30 seconds. This effect is removed if the player is healed above 95%. This is actually very interesting because, one, in Diablo 3, uh, the only really healing power we have in the beginning was that monks were the support, like in general, in the beginning. Monks, Breath of Heaven was like healing, right? And then over time, the monk represented the support for a while before other classes also came into the picture. I mean, every class had a way of supporting by means of gaming in general. But as soon as the monk started phasing into health globes and stuff, everyone else was like wondering what kind of other supports can we have. And over time, uh, more and more support classes came into the picture. And so then the healing process changed. So instead of healing, we have more about just flat or damage reduction or damage mitigation or damage negation kind of style of supporting uh, in terms of the defense side. More and more into the offense is the current way of providing support, right? We either crowd control stuff or actually just giving damage so that everything goes faster, right? So necrotic would be an interesting monster affix as well. And then we have the resource leech. Hitting a player removes 65% of their maximum resource. While this is not the same as exhaustion, but it is towards the resource orb because we have necrotic that touches the health orb, right? So there has got to be one and the other. So this is very reminiscent of the Urgos Warren for zones. So how it says here, section one. So these sections are zones, right? So with the health degeneration, you don't really want your healers to start dying too much, right? So you want to keep your group, your different groups in a certain way so that you can fight the monsters better. And you also don't want to stand in the zone, so you want to pull stuff, right? You want to lure them. So the crowd control of how you kite and drag has to be good, right? And so when we talk about resource leech, you have to make sure that you don't get hit. And if you do, well, good luck on your resource. So that is something that I find very interesting. That was something that finally popped up, which is why I had both screens up, because I actually had a lot of fun uh, playing as a healer for Urgos Warren. I was the monk elementalist, and now I was originally the monk elementalist since the beginning. Uh, and not just because, oh look, elementalist gets to echo as the elite skill where I can echo my group heals. No, it wasn't just because of this Urgos Warren that I had changed to the Monk Elementalist. I was playing Monk Elementalist the whole time when Monk Elementalist was not meta, or Monk Elementalist was not really in the picture for, doubling your group heal and stuff like that. So for this one, I was the Monk Elementalist, the third healer, where I called out the sixth group heal that I could do because my energy bar was able to spend to the sixth group heal. So I can cast my group heals 6 times instead of 5. And so as soon as I get to the sixth one, the other healers should have more than half of their energy back at the time. So this allows the rotation safer for the entire group because the other healers can manage the heals in a certain way such that my monk elementalist offered an additional buffer for them to regain their energy. And it wasn't just my buffering, but also the timing for the necro battery necro to be able to give uh, energy back at a certain pace that is not going to drain the necromancer itself, right? And so I give room to enable the necromancer to have enough time to not need to give energy back to 3 healers, but 2 for the most part, because my 6th heal enables more time, right? So now that we're done with this section, we can go on to the next thing, which has nothing to do with necessarily of Guild Wars original. So we can focus on uh, just the patch notes. So we have the solo self found, right? And here they say that we decided to bring solo self found to Diablo 3 after years of players requesting an officially supported single player mode. And so this will be, you know, really, really cool. Challenge risks can be completed with a party, while the mode is seasonal. Solo Self-Found is a solitary journey, so you will be unable to start this mode while in a party or access multiplayer aspects of Diablo 3 such as trading. Rebirthing is available for Solo Self-Found. The Season 29 Vision of Enmity theme and the other components of patch 2.7.6 were designed with Solo Self-Found in mind. We urge you to test it out and give us feedback about your experience. I mean, it comes down to how you get back your health, right? If you do get hit. So that will be interesting for solo play. So let's go ahead and move on to the next thing, right? Paragon ceiling. We are introducing changes to the Paragon points to work in tandem with Solo Self-Found and the Season 29 theme. You can only assign a total of 800 Paragon points to your character. Previously, you were only able to assign a total of 50 Paragon points to each attribute within the core, defense, offense, and utility categories. But now you can assign up to 200 in each attribute. Each category can only have 200 points placed into them. Mm, hmm. The developers note, we understand that Paragon was king in terms of character power with this change in the season. I'm reading it differently. We wanted to shift that power from main stat grinding to gameplay knowledge and gear hunting. I mean, I've always been playing for gear hunting anyway. We chose 800 as our initial starting point and would appreciate your feedback on this cap. There are a few changes within the Paragon system to keep in mind. Movement speed. We changed movement speed to 0.125% per point because the old value would have provided players with 100% movement speed, which was too much. Players now have the option to place points into this stat, allowing them to surpass 25% movement speed from item bonuses. Mhm. Area damage. Area damage should perform the same, if not a bit better, and with substantial improvements to performance. Well, I mean, if it's area damage build, then it would be amazing. And and in fact, then the gear stats have more room for another stat potentially. So that that's pretty interesting. The Of course, 800 as a cap, uh, I think is it's interesting that the soft cap for Paragons was 800, and then they decided to cap it at the same quote unquote soft cap. So thematically speaking, it makes sense that they try to stick with the 800 rule of thumb, but I find that going to be not cool depending on the build. So, however, I would say this. In season 26, we have the Echoing Nightmare. Now, obviously, I'm not going to just talk about the Echoing Nightmare. I'm more talking about the power at which I understood season 26 as, though you have to understand and learn what your set could actually do and actually perform, rather than hoping that the seasonal theme itself boosts in the positive direction of damage, right? So this will be very interesting to see how people play it like season 26, because season 26 was one of several seasons where you needed to understand the power from your build itself rather than the seasonal theme. Because, for example, in season 21, right, we have, you know, the zone effect of when you hit 100 stacks, you know, you accumulate 100 stacks, and then it will release that 100 stacks and cast random of between 4 effects onto your vicinity, right? And each person, well, the strategy came later where certain people want to, in a group play, certain people will release the 100 stacks in a certain way in terms of timing. And so there was a lot of group uh, momentum based on how well you understand each other based on distance of that release of the 100 stacks, right? And so that was part of the way that a seasonal theme affects damage output. But now, when we talk about this kind of situation where there's a Paragon ceiling as well, then there's a lot of damage that it comes with your gearing rather than, oh, I'm just gonna keep keep getting Paragons. At some point, you have to adjust your gear, and the point of gearing, right, is to improve your own damage by knowing how your gear actually is supposed to perform. For example, if it is an area damage oriented build, right, then you want to optimize your gear at some point at the end, area damage. So at first, you would work on your cooldown stuff or your attack speed stuff, whichever the case for certain builds, right? At the end, the luxury of obtaining area damage on your gear comes next to actually help you to play upon the area damage orientedness of the build itself. Now, with this attribute change, with this Paragon ceiling, right? As far as what it says here, area damage, right? So if we think about just putting everything to one attribute, then we speed up your gearing. So in terms of looking for area damage stuff, right? We can prioritize area damage first from our paragons. to already speed things up. So while there's a ceiling, by means of using your paragons, you effectively increase your damage already. And then later on, depending on how much gearing you decide to do, then you can redistribute. But the question is, would you redistribute if it is an area damage oriented build, right? But that's the same thing with why people get paragons. And people get paragons for the main stat, right? It says, with this change, we wanted to shift the power from main stat grinding to gameplay knowledge, right? And gear hunting. So, meaning that meaning that what it says here, main stat grinding. Now, a lot of people have been focusing on main stat, and that is the problem, right? The time duration, not only the time duration we have for the rift, the greater rift, right? Everyone wants, you know, under 2 minutes, under 3 minutes, under 1 minute, whichever the case, right? But that wasn't the only thing that people wanted. People wanted to play main stat strictly. So if if we wanted to play main stat strictly, then why don't we play like World of Warcraft or games where we would select the icon, right? The role icon as DPS. Well, if you're as DPS, the what would be grayed out or disabled would be the vitality, right? The vitality should be grayed out because there was no need. I mean, the vitality should be from your gear. If your gear is decent and correct, right? By right, you don't need any more vitality, such that you, as a DPS, you can focus on DPS, right? The the vitality comes from the healer of those group rating, where the support is supposed to give you back the health that you need in order to DPS. So this part of the Paragon luxury, right, in terms of understanding how to distribute the core stats, wasn't really just the main stat either. Because for people who are like 3K or more Paragon, right? People who actually earn more than 3K Paragon will realize that they can play around with their Paragons such that they can get up to 1 billion health as a good foundation, because they didn't necessarily need to get, you know, that main stat grinding, because they know that you can split the priority between main stat and vitality. So while of course, everyone wants full damage, Paragons enabled people to actually get more vitality that they didn't originally have, which is the other part of Paragoning in itself. However, people chose to be main stat oriented, right? I mean, even augmenting. I mean, where does augmenting vitality come in, right? There shouldn't be such a thing, right? The recipe in itself to be able to use the amethyst is ridiculous, right? It helps with what? For example, it helps with hardcore. It helps with sharing gear between classes so that you don't have to re-augment to the main stat, right? For example, stone gauntlets or squirts necklace. If you get the ultimate flex elemental trifecta, so any element you want on a squirts necklace, ancient or primal, right? Then you can just augment vitality so that you can share with any class you want instead of putting down main stat. But of course, we can say that, oh, I'm done with that one other class. I can just augment the other class main stat anyway because Whispers of Atonement or gems, I have a lot of 150 in stock. I can just re-augment anytime I want, right? That is the ultimate reasoning. But if we want to maintain, you know, the way to share gear of such caliber, we would augment vitality so that you don't have to use any vitality in the core, which is the whole point of this main stat grinding, right? Nobody wants to pump not main stat. So, augmenting vitality can be a thing. It just so happened that main stat is king. So, everyone or most people augment even the main stat. But then when they switch to another class that isn't the same main stat, they have to re-augment the main stat on those particular pieces that they share. So like Cindercoat, if you have a decent Cindercoat that you can share for the most part without considering the primary stats being the main stat difference, the augment part of it is what's important, then you have to re-augment to the main stat that you want, right? So there's that issue, which is now going to be interesting because, you know, based on gameplay knowledge, for example, right, if your helmet has a skill damage involved, then your helmet cannot get 1000 vitality. Then you need that 1000 vitality in the core itself. So you would pump that 200 paragons to vitality. So where does this cap come in is this part. The cap is actually annoying because now we only have that 200 to look into. And so now the question is, what is the value? What is the value of main stat versus the other ones in the core, right? And it's actually really interesting that they decided to also show the offense tab. I actually find that very interesting that they decided to out of out of all the other possible tabs, they chose to just um show the offense tab. And and the distribution is weird, but I find that very interesting that they sort of hide the the other tabs. I mean, unless I can click something else, but I don't think so. Anyway, I just find that very interesting that they decided to show just this tab when, especially that they talked about the movement speed and the area damage in the notes. I mean, technically speaking, when they do notes is uh above and beyond the scope of the previous paragraphs and the picture. So I get it in terms of like the order of how the order and format that certain things are written. But like if we want to talk about like how this goes, it would be better if they showed like the different tabs as well. But it would be kind of suggestive um in the way that then there's nothing to play if people knew what to do, right? So there's a lot of testing that people can have by not showing the other tabs because this tab that's currently shown in the picture is like it doesn't tell much. It doesn't necessarily influence anyone, which is basically a very neutral picture. But the point is that it's just funny that they decided not to show even the core or the utility, right? Because that's the two that are the most significant in terms of the change that it affects. Now, of course, what does this tab show though is that if your build is an attack speed build, for example, then this would be an interesting picture because then somebody might be able to prioritize attack speed and get to the next breakpoint, right? And this picture shows a lot of that if the build is attack speed oriented, right? So that's the positive. But the whole point of this picture, I just think that it's very neutral. So that's actually interesting. Community-led changes. With each patch and season, the community has communicated quality of life improvements they would like to see added to Diablo 3. We always take the time to review the feedback we receive, evaluate it, and implement changes that align with our design principles for the game. Below is a series of highly requested quality of life updates that are included in the patch 2.7.6 PTR. Thank you for your continued feedback over the years. So, Greater Rift monsters. The monster sets removed toxic lurkers and added Val swarms. You know, so for those, well, at least for me, those toxic lurkers were really, really annoying because they keep sliding away, right? I mean, that's my opinion. Um, Now, toxic lurkers are not the only issue, uh, necessarily speaking. For example, I call them the runner monster types. So, like, if you do bounties, right, and you do the Act 1 crypt areas, uh, you have to kill what? Something brown, right? Those are like the runners that's one of the runner monster types. The other ones are like, the zombie mothers, right? Where they have to run away in order to put range to add the distance between you and them such that they can spit out another zombie. So they move, away. And then we have the Blazing Guardians, right? The Blazing Constructs, where they start walking further and further away from each other as well. So, but the challenge of the Blazing Guardians, though, is that they still deal damage correctly, Whereas the toxic lurkers, as far as I can tell, their goal is just to waste your time. I mean, that's just me. Their goal was to waste your time. So I I think that this is an interesting move because Vile Swarms give lots of progress. I mean, the Vile Swarms in terms of progression percent, I don't know the specific number, but Vile Swarms are so good that, people want more of it. And so this is an interesting change. Now, I don't know if toxic lurkers are supposed to be the one chosen, but I would think that them sliding is so annoying because their goal isn't really to attack you like straight up. Their goal is just to like suddenly hide behind another monster, for example. So, I mean, that's what I think of the lurkers, unless I'm thinking of some other monster type. But anyway, that's my opinion on this monster set. Greater Rift Monster Set 10 removed Dark Berserkers and added Savage Beasts. Hmm, that is interesting. Now, I find it funny that Dark Berserkers are taken out in two different ways. One is that long time ago, I never liked Dark Berserkers. I never liked Dark Berserkers in the beginning because they hit so hard when you don't dodge, when you don't bother to dodge it, right? So hammer dudes are so painful when they do hit. And then I think this change here, it's not because of that. I think this change here is because in the number of monsters density, Dark Berserkers just don't pop up that often. And when they do, we have to kill them. But at that point, you might as well be more consistent with giving Savage Beast instead, which is why this change, which is why this change is the way it is. I don't think it has the I don't think it has to do with me, for example, myself being afraid of the damage potential of a Dark Berserker proccing my cheat death, for example, because Dark Berserkers can. So I think that it's more about the consistency of what we have to do in the Greater Rift when Dark Berserkers spawn in terms of our like we're like the magnetism of needing to kill Dark Berserkers. We might as well have Savage Beasts instead because of the way that Dark Berserkers are kind of awkward in terms of progression. So I could be wrong, but that's what I think it is. But it's good news though, because I don't like Dark Berserkers in terms of damage incoming. Not to say that Savage Beasts are not difficult either, but I would say that the Dark Berserkers are annoying because they actually proc your cheat death most of the time. If you don't kill them, if you actually try to take a hit, they can proc your cheat death right up. And so that's something that I I thought was really annoying in vanilla especially. And then over time, I disliked Fire Shamans because when Greater Rifts came out, they became worse and worse as we increased the tier. So initially, right, Fire Shamans are not annoying because we never really used Squirt's Necklace in the first place. That's one part of the thing. The other part of the thing is that progression wise, over the tiers, because the GR tiers were so low that you kill each monster, it just feels roughly the same anyway. As long as you consistently kill, you gain some progress. But Fire Shamans became worse and worse. So Fire Shamans became my one of my main arch nemesis of monster types, aside from Dark Berserkers dealing maximum damage when when you're doing your bounties and stuff, and even like campaign. Dark Berserkers uh, in the Halls of Agony are just agonizing, pun intended, right? So in terms of Greater Rift, the Dark Berserkers were kind of like a was kind of like a subset in terms of their um, chance to provide progress, meaning that when they do pop up, you have to kill them. But when they don't really pop up that often, it affects the whole progress, by which you have to isolate yourself with the purpose of killing the Dark Berserkers to actually obtain progress percent. So by adding Savage Beasts, right, we have the consistency that you don't have to suddenly change your momentum to kill Dark Berserkers specifically. You can just keep killing the stuff that you think is important by means of moving correctly. Because so sometimes you see a Dark Berserker here and there, you're like, oh, I now have to stop and isolate myself to purposely kill several Dark Berserkers before moving forward. Whereas Savage Beasts as a whole, one, if they didn't follow you, that's one thing. But in general, you don't have to isolate, like picking up, oh, look, there's three Dark Berserkers there. I have to pick out those three before moving on. Savage Beast, it's more like you're already doing that. You're already killing them to gain progress, so it doesn't really change the momentum in the rift. So I think that's why they did that, which is a good thing. So it's not like in the group it's like, oh, you should be killing those Dark Berserkers. It's kind of funny actually. All right, so Monk changes added a buff icon when proccing the legendary item Flying Dragon. Oh yeah, so this one is kind of like the necessary thing because uh uh, the the suggested method was to open your inventory and like look at the damage number. So that's definitely something really good that they did for the Flying Dragon. Moving your mouse underneath the character while casting Tempest Rush Flurry stacks should no long. I think I didn't read that in the correct tempo. But anyway, while casting Tempest Rush, flurry stacks should no longer reset randomly. You know, that's I mean, not that it was a thing for me. I mean, I didn't really identify it specifically, but I feel like this change. I mean, I didn't know if it was like flurry stacks per se, but like I thought it was weird when when POJ when that set first came out and I tried it for like briefly, and I mean briefly, that was one thing that I found annoying outside of the stone gauntlets being the other thing. I always found it weird. Like there was something weird. So apparently this is one of the several things that is weird. I think that's why I stayed away from Tempest Rush um in general. Is because there's something weird about it. And I guess this is what it is. I mean, I've never asked too many Tempest Rush players about what significant things, but like I feel like there were some components in there as to why I stayed away from Tempest Rush builds. I mean, I don't mind Tempest Rush as a skill. Uh, I would love to play Tempest Rush if that was like let's say like like blinding faith Tempest Rush monk as a crowd control like setup. I mean, it's just for fun, right? You just you just blind everything as you're Tempest rushing. I think it's kind of cool. It's kind of like the Diablo 2 Boazon, where you can just play a blind Boazon and blind everything, right? In the Chaos Sanctuary. A blind Boazon in Chaos Sanctuary is awesome. So for me, when I think of Tempest Rush, I just think of Tempest Rush in that manner because your goal is to try to Tempest Rush density, and you might as well blind them, or else you're just blindly rushing into monsters and getting hit on purpose, right? The the goal is not to get hit, but if you're doing Tempest Rush, you're bound to get hit. So I feel like my style of Tempest Rush and what would entice me to play Tempest Rush more is the fact that I would play it if it was like a Tempest Rush blinding build. So that's something that like whenever I see Tempest Rush finally get some um, attention is when I would love to talk about the Tempest Rush blinding stuff rather than not playing the build at all. Let's see. Haunted Visions for the Necromancer. Haunted Visions used to remove skeletal mages from Simulacrum only if the player had Grim Scythe on their action bar. Now it will remove skeletal mages regardless. Oh, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Requiem's Sear Plate was not calculating the correct amount of essence and was adding way too much overflow access essence per tick. This has been fixed. Haha. So I see. Removed Mastermind from the champion portion of the seasonal journey. This means you no longer must master a set dungeon. Instead, it has been replaced with overcoming the trials, which asks you to complete an echoing nightmare. Ah, haha. So, I mean, this is in line with so this replacement is in line with the so-called to experience doing an echoing nightmare, just like the altar needing to sacrifice a whisper of atonement, right? So, but when we talk about the master, though, the must master, yeah, it was an issue because some classes, the player wants to play only this build. So some people like to salvage everything else, right? They just don't want to play anything else because they only want to play a certain set. And so, but then the dungeon though, the set dungeon, the mastering part of it is like sometimes it's just a hassle. I mean, it is set dungeons are supposed to was supposed to be like a challenge. But when the mastering is like a necessity, it became like a burden to like needing to think about whether they can play a different set in order to master. Because there's always usually one set that's a little easier to master, and then they end up needing to recollect the other set just to master it. I mean, obviously, if we want to think about somebody playing a certain set every single time, then they should know what to do after a certain amount of gameplay for the set that they actually know how to play or did research for, right? But at the same time, sometimes the requirement is so tedious that the necessity to get the mastery done is just not something that somebody naturally wants to do while playing the set. So, like, if I wanted to try a new set, right, then if let's say that's the set that I'm just gonna stick with the entire season, then that set dungeon, if I've never played it before, now I have to master it, but it's so annoying for some reason, for whatever reason it could be, then this seasonal journey is another reason why I leave it to the end. Because if you have been playing through the season for that set, you're now more acclimated for that set, right? So you kind of get to know what you're supposed to do in terms of the rotation. And even like in solo, when you're pushing, you're kiting and dragging density. So in a way, when you do a certain mastery of a set dungeon, sometimes they ask you to, like, let's say, you know, I mean, not necessarily it's a mastery, but let's just say you have to multi-shot like 20 monsters. Well, in pushing, there's a very high chance that you actually hit 20 monsters at the same time anyway, right? Such that at that time, you would be more acclimated to hit 20 for the mastery. But of course, the problem is that the set dungeon has these density pockets that are just like it's like 21 scorpions or something. So if you accidentally killed two while moving there or while hurting, then your multi-shot hits 19, that density pocket is screwed, right? You screwed over one pocket. So if you continuously screw over those different pockets, then you have to restart for the mastery, as an example. So this replacement is basically like the altar sacrifice, where you just make sure that you complete an echoing nightmare. Now, it's kind of vague though. I mean, completing an echoing nightmare. It's kind of vague though. I mean, com- so completing an echoing nightmare just means what? Get to the stash? Like get to the chest? I think it's a little vague, isn't it? Unless I'm just not reading it correctly, which asks you to complete an echoing nightmare. I think it's vague. I think they'll reword this the next time you see this. Yeah, I think they'll reword this at some point. All right, next point. Due to the unique animation of how Hamlin dies, there were many issues with how it rewards kill credit. Hamlin now rewards kill credit to the closest player on death. Haha. I mean, it was just funny that there was no kill credit. Corrupted angels and all variations would sometimes do an attack that does double damage without any indication that it was a unique move. This has been changed to deal the same damage as normal attacks. Right. Right. Yeah, I see. Added greater rift map checkpoints to battlefields and boneyards. Yeah, this part this part is good. Because uh there are a lot of players who actually take advantage. I mean, I I myself don't like to die as much as you know, softcore is softcore, right? But I don't pride myself to necessarily like dying per se in each instance, right? Of course, of course, if the situation sucks or if your gearing doesn't match up with the tier that you're currently doing, then you'll die a lot, right? So then you have the situation where you're fighting the Rift Guardian, right? And so me personally, I haven't been using the checkpoints too much because of this. Like it wasn't like specifically targeted to where I knew about the checkpoint issue, but it's more about just trying to perform what you need to perform at the location that you have to deal with, right? So what happens with this? What happens with this greater rift map checkpoints to battlefields and boneyards? Well, I think boneyard is because it's newer. I mean, I don't know about the new thing being affecting why the checkpoints weren't added to boneyards necessarily, but the battlefields portion, I think it's really interesting that they didn't have a checkpoint, which what happened is that if let's say I'm doing my greater rift pushing and I normally don't do this, but like using revive the checkpoint saves those seconds. But of course, we can also say that it takes the Rift Guardian a little bit of time to get to you, to spawn on you. But that's the whole idea of revive at checkpoint method as a strategy. And so what happens with this change and add addition to the battlefield checkpoint is that now that this is done, battlefields go back up a little bit more in terms of ideal maps. I mean, Battlefield is already an ideal map. The problem with Battlefields being probably the lowest tier of the ideal maps is because of this checkpoint issue, where people use the checkpoints as an advantage. Because there's also another advantage to checkpoints is that if the pylon spawned in the beginning of the rift floor, of that floor, then you want to use the revive the checkpoint as a stylistic strategy as well. So I like to do those kinds of pylon positioning strategies, but not necessarily using the revive the checkpoint in that sense. But in this sense, that I want to point out is that I would use revive the checkpoint specifically for pylon spawns. If they spawn closer to the door, when I spawned the Rift Guardian much later, and I would use the strategy of revive the checkpoint as a way to time the pylon spawn, though, of what I kept on that floor in the beginning of the floor. This is a good fix for battlefields. Now, for Boneyard, I mean, they added that to the Rift Pool, Greater Rift Pool later, right? And so the odd part about Boneyard is that I just think that the entrance to wherever you go is not that far, necessarily speaking, compared to battlefields being quite far in terms of like the Rift Guardian positioning versus you. But this checkpoint issue has more to do with the advantage of the revive timer. So I guess if we want to balance out everything, they have to make sure that the boneyards actually have that checkpoint as well. But the battlefields is a big one that is a plus. So then uh, it rebalances the battlefields in terms of the ideal maps. And speaking of ideal maps, we line ourselves up for the next bullet point. Corvus, ice caves, and spider caves no longer spawn in greater rifts. Oh man, this is this is great. I mean, I don't like the spider caves because of the amount of distance that you have to spend going through that alleyway, the first alleyway of nothingness, right? That alleyway eats up your resource already. Not to mention what the the floor does in terms of progression, but that alleyway is so annoying. It's kind of like doubling the time of the Ariat crater, where the Ariat crater has that beginning part as well, and even that is annoying already. Spider caves is that long first hallway is just so useless and pointless. I love that they're taking this out. Corvus people definitely want that out because of the closed doors, right? So, or well, not just closed doors. It's more so like just the if we want to compare Keeps and Corvus, Corvus is just basically a labyrinth that you don't want to deal with, so to speak, in terms of Keeps versus Corvus. So, in general, Corvus being taken out is huge because the time that it takes, right, to get out of that map is insane. So I'm glad that they took it out based on the time. For me, it's more about the time factor of Corvus. And I think for the most part that is the time issue. The door thing is the obvious thing, right? Ice caves, mm, I think so. Um, I just have a feeling that I mean I don't know. Okay, ice caves. Does it have to be ice caves though? Because I feel like some underground caves are bad, or like caves in general are bad. So I'm not totally certain as to why ice is specified. Now, in terms of the ice portion, I would say that the ice caves were also terrible because of where the pylon spawns. So if you get an ice caves pylon that is silly, then the underground caves, the other kinds of caves, were better at the pylon spawning. So to me, that might be the reasoning behind ice specifically, but I just don't know why. But wait a second. So I'm reading Spider Caves, but like when I read Spider Caves, I think of the Queen Aranea one. Are they talking about all the types of caves? They must be, right? I mean, again, this is just my terminology and my nomenclature versus the generalized nomenclature. So, hmm. Anyway, I just think that the Spider Cavern is the Spider Cavern of the Queen Aranea one, which is the long alleyway of nothingness, versus the underground caves, which is also considered spider caves. But anyway, it's a good thing that they took out more stuff so that the consistency of Greater Rift pushing is, improved. Or Extreme's versions of Desolate Sands and Shrouded Moor have had their monster density increased. Mm. Well, it makes sense for Desolate Sands, especially in Auric Stream, to pop up better because in the Desolate Sands of a Torment 16, like a regular Rift Desolate Sands is good. Like the density in that should be how it is in Greater Rift, but when we're talking about especially or extreme ones, the Desolate Sands should make sense to where you actually get the correct amount of density. So I'm glad that they did that for Aura Extreme ones. Now, Shrouded Moors, I'm I don't even like it in general. I don't know about like I think this is a I think this is a very interesting move. I mean, I don't know if this is like necessarily like the community change portion. I mean, I prefer that the Shrouded Moors in the Torment 16 Rift, the Nephilim Rift, to be increased. I don't know about the. So I'm not sure if they're missing a comma, or are they really talking about Aura Extremes for both of these? So for me, I want the Shrouded more in the regular rifts to have more density. I don't. I mean, I don't mind Shrouded more in pushing, as opposed to sometimes it being an issue where we don't want the pylon to be in the Shrouded more because we don't like the Shrouded more as a. It's almost like not liking Hell Rifts because the smaller Hell Rifts do not have the pylon spawn, right? And so we don't actually like Hell Rifts. And then if they did spawn the Hell Rifts, the slightly larger Hell Rifts that actually have the pylon spawn, sometimes we don't actually want that pylon to be there either because whatever the next rift is, it might eat up the time because we want to set up the pylon from the Hell Rift such that the Hell Rift should be giving enough density that the pylon should play better and not to waste the pylon on the Hell Rift that has a pylon spawn versus the pylon spawning in the next floor instead. So, Shrouded more as a connector, I mean, in the Aura Extremes, they might not have had enough potential to make it reasonable as a consistency of Aura Extremes themselves, such that they are increasing the monster density there to make it more worthwhile for Aura Extremes themselves, then yes, I would think so. That it is a good decision. So that's interesting. I mean, if this Aura Extremes did not if this bullet point did not have a comma missing somewhere, because I feel like this Shrouded more, I'm more sided with the Torment 16 being the issue of density when getting your key farming, regular Rift stuff. Class balance changes. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail other than the Vigilante belt. Finally, a Vigilante belt gets a rework with a passive, just like in Season 27 when they finalized to give Mempo of Twilight some action. And this is what they decided to give Vigilante belt. While riding your warhorse, Fist of Heavens deals increased damage equal to your movement speed and is automatically called down on a random nearby enemy at an interval based on your attack speed if it is on your action bar. That is very specific. I like how they're being more specific, and also they added that part where it says based on your attack speed, which is kind of like talking about based on pickup radius if if there were more changes to certain items or additional legendary passives that I would think upon, it would be something like based on your pickup radius and so on. So I thought that this is like very specific. So this is very interesting to have your stats. The Vigilante Belt also tests the Paragon tab changes as well. So this Vigilante Belt is actually interesting twofold. One is for the class stuff to make Crusader interesting, but also to kind of check what the attributes in your paragons would do. I think it's actually interesting that this belt received this at this timing. That's just something interesting. Gears of Dreadland. So they're gonna be changing this. Gain 4 seconds when attacking with a primary skill at a maximum duration of 20 seconds. This duration begins counting down after the delay after each application. So in the notes, in the notes, we wanted Gears of Dreadland to be easier to play optimally. However, we had to forego the visual indicator that showed stacks. Yeah, so the visual indicator was interesting, right? I mean, the issue was it was also latency affected as far as when I played on my EU side. I also felt not only the issue itself, but also the latency giving me the issue. So it was doubling down on the issue. So this is going to help me. This change is going to help me play uh, Gears of Dreadland on a different region better. Now, if we're talking about the change as a whole, it helps with not needing to play it a certain way, which is going to help everyone, right? So we keep on needing to press to increase to 20 stacks, and now it's going in reverse where you want to remember to press. So that's what they're saying. You just have to remember to press, right? It it goes in line with the whole idea behind safe passage, or even blinding speed, right? Where those runes you have to remember to press, or even like anything else, right? Um, Wraps of clarity, focus and restraint, stuff like that. It's like after X seconds, it falls off. Or like legendary gems, your Taeguk stacks, it falls off. Your stacks fall off, right? So Gears of Dreadland's change um, of this change, instead of it being increasing, it's checking as a reminder, which is the whole application of everything else anyway. So this change is, in line with everything else that has been going with the other stuff, because they always put after, you know, after 5 seconds, something falls off. But of course, you know, this though, I would say that this change though, it it makes it to where, uh well, it's not so much about which stack it's gonna be on, but like your primary skills deal 10% increased damage per second of momentum. It's kind of awkward for the second half of the text, because because you're bound to get the increased damage. It's like there's two sides to this. One is like you might as well just, well, they have to say what the damage increase is. I get it. But the problem is that based on the second sentence, the third sentence of this set bonus thing, is that the statement doesn't have to, like, it it's like there, but it shouldn't be there, is what I'm saying. It's there for knowing the increase of damage, but when we're talking about per second of momentum, if you read it a little differently, it sort of makes it like it downplays how it's played, in terms of like we're getting it as a direct max already. So instead of just making us do 10 times 20, as a mathematical visual in the sentence, it just feels like they could just say it outright instead, which is why this sentence is like, it's like it should be there, but it also shouldn't be there. Witch Doctor, the Cluck Eye, they're changing it to a nonsense sound to casting Hex. Angry Chicken turns all your pets into exploding chickens. Chickens deal 150 to 200% increased damage, and Angry Chicken deals 50% more damage per exploded chicken. Are they are they bringing back the zero cooldown zombie dogs, but in a different way? Wow. they're turning it into a different way, because I actually like the zero cooldown zombie dogs. That was how it was. But because a lot of people love the Angry Chicken build, and specifically, you know, and so they're they're turning this Cluck Eye into the zero cooldown zombie dogs kind of concept for this. Wow. Finally, there might be a reason to play again. There might be a reason to play Witch Doctor again. I mean, I don't really play Chicken Doctor all that much, if at all. But I like the exploding chickens thing. And then the other part is that deals 50% more damage per exploded chicken. It's kind of like in line with how they reworked Natalia's, right? With the chain reaction blasts, right? I think they did that for that aspect, to make people choose between whether they want to play the Natalia Straps or the Witch Doctor Chicken Explosions. Now, because if you read what they changed here, this part this part feels just like the Natalia's rework in a different way, in that manner, right? Because it says while gaining 75% damage reduction, that 75% damage reduction is what gave it away. Like, it made me think of the Natalia's traps 4-piece bonus thing that got increased from 60% to 75%, but now they're directly saying it's 75% because you have to play up close, right? So this is basically the so-called Natalia's traps, but on the Witch Doctor, which is amazing because it gives love to the Witch Doctor, and they focused also on the Crusader a little bit up here. I don't know if it gives very much something, but it might. And then the God DH is quote unquote easier to play. But definitely this gives for me the exploding aspect something that gives me some nostalgia for the exploding. But of course, chickens are, you know, I mean, exploding chickens are funny, I guess, versus the other thing, right? So, that's definitely something that they brought back, uh, for me anyway. But one thing I have to, one thing I have to say though, I it's just funny because exploding radius, I guess they never really it wasn't really affected or a thing necessarily. So it's kind of like the traps. They just treat it like the exploding radius would be the exploding radius of the traps, because what they took out of the other old vanilla build was that the exploding the explosion radius got chopped, and so it affected the build, not only the damage but the build itself. And so they're bringing back exploding stuff, which is going to be interesting. So Cluck Eye, so this would be in the cube, right? Because it's just kind of weird. Yeah, it's got to be in the cube because the Majuma set is on you. Yeah, so that's interesting. It's interesting that they gave the Cluck Eye some other kind of love instead of some sound when attacking. So now, so now there's a purpose. But the funny thing is though, I mean, they had to they see the other part about the wording of this. The wording though, like chickens deal 150 to 200%. I guess I guess they did this because in case you haven't gotten your set, it gives a bit of the RNG into this part. I just think this part is weird because eventually eventually you extract this. So I just thought to myself, why can't they just work on it like some of the items where you get a direct 200%. I mean, direct max percent. But this is to cover this variance, this varying range is to cover that if you did get a clock eye early on, there is a fun component and a not fun component to the clock eye, I guess. Fun being max damage, not fun being you get the least damage, right? While while leveling, while gearing. So I just think this one is kind of an interesting like phrasing. I'm not sure if they're gonna keep it that way, but it is how it is, right? Generally speaking, they want to have a varying range, but I just feel like if we're not gonna equip it anyway, it really doesn't matter. The only equipping portion is when you find it early before you do other things. So before you get this, that's why it's there. So that's something that's something that might actually make me play Witch Doctor for to have the love of exploding stuff. So like for example, right? Uh, for example, um, let me go to my game, right? If we go back to my original Witch Doctor, if we go back to my original Witch Doctor, right? So the original Witch Doctor is this is the this is the zero cooldown zombie dog stuff. So if we are exploding stuff, then that's what I enjoy playing. And so that will be interesting. Now, so that's the set, right? That's the set that they are gonna be changing the the set bonuses. Well, revising anyway. Which is why I talked about the Cluck Eye, because the Cluck Eye is going to be equipped only when you're leveling if you get it early. But as soon as you get your set done, it's going to be extracted, so it doesn't matter. So it's kind of like those weapons you get uh where you get like, what are those weapons? The Grand Vizier, uh the incense torch and all that. Like it maxes out anyway, and I feel like they should have just done it that way for the sake of the extraction. But I guess the RNG sets itself preset before prior to having the set. Is what I'm trying to say. So that's a good amount of changes that they that they put up. Bugs fixed an issue where interacting with mail at the end of the season had the potential to cause a crash. Oh, really? Fixed a game crash that occurred when demon hunters utilized specific item and skill combinations. Aha. Huh. I mean, I don't remember it, but maybe that was what happened that one day when my friend went to his networking of getting the bounty caches, and then I had a game crash. But I don't know if I did anything different such that it caused this. But it could be that. It could be this specific bug that caused that crash. So that's interesting. Fixed an issue where the witch doctor's angry chicken skill was not dealing as much damage as indicated in the description. Oh, really? Okay. Fixed an issue where the number of wizard mirror images were barely visible on the game icon. Okay. Fixed an issue with some icons in the altar rights having hard edges. Okay. All right. So why I have the other screen up again is because I find it interesting that the the stuff here and the stuff here are very cool because it makes because it makes the gameplay kind of strategic, just like in Urgos Warren. So that'll be something interesting to see. That'll be something interesting to see. Well, that's it for the patch notes. That's it for the PTR patch notes, August 15, huh? So this was a late kind of, well, semi-ish late because I mean, 4 days. So that'll be interesting, I guess. Get to do something different in 4 days. The the only thing very interesting is the this disturbance has given way to visions of enmity pocket dimensions that are accessed by stepping through diabolical fissures. So the one thing interesting is these portals. So encountering the fissure maximize your chance of earning useful gear. How how valuable is the word is the phrasing of useful gear? That's the better question. So you can encounter these. It kind of reminds me of uh so when I do my bounties, right? And then like sometimes I see a rainbow goblin, and what I always say when I see a rainbow goblin is that sometimes I'm not as excited about it is because my objective is to get the bounties done. And so when they have this kind of thing, it makes me think of like it makes me think of like ah they're just trying to waste my time, you know? So I have this issue, but it'll be interesting. It'll be something, different, I guess. But or like when you get a goblin and you get like a free vault, which is, there's a good and bad about that. So, um the goblin shrine, right? When you get a goblin shrine and then you have a free portal, especially a free vault portal, sometimes when you're clicking, let's say somebody decides to click on the loot or accidentally click on the loot and then they fall into the vault, like you know how in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game where you fall into the manhole, right? And like people fell, like people players fell into the vault, and then while the goblin shrine kills are still going upstairs, the person downstairs get reduced loot because they weren't active upstairs. So like this kind of portaling makes me think of that, but also like quote unquote time wasting. So we will see what this maximizing is all about. And it says the visions are quite unstable and have the potential to produce additional fissures. So it is the endless dungeon thing. I'm just trying to reread certain aspects because I just find it that it's a distraction, but it's also like the value and what it entails, right? And so I guess this is gonna be this is gonna be interesting because of this very notion that it does say have the potential to produce additional fissures. So it'll be fun to try this out in 4 days. Well, that's the PTR section.